What is going on with Varys, Illyrio, and young Griff, or Aegon VI, Fagon, whatever you want to call him? What has Varys been up to all this time? What is the plan? And will it work? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into the worlds of A Song of Ice and Fire, The Lord of the Rings, and The Witcher. Welcome. This is a compilation of 9 separate videos I did about Varys, Illyrio, and young Griff, stitched together into one huge video for your convenience. I hope you enjoy it. Sir Barristan Selmy went from Lord Commander of Joffrey's Kingsguard to Lord Commander of Daenerys' Queensguard and Hand of the Queen on the other side of the world very quickly. How did that happen? Was it just him deciding to switch sides, or was there someone subtly pulling the strings behind the scene? A spider, perhaps. How on earth did Sir Barristan Selmy go from being Lord Commander of Joffrey's Kingsguard to Lord Commander of Dany's Queensguard so quickly? It's one of the biggest turnarounds in the whole series, and I want to suggest that this isn't just a matter of one man's conscience and good reputation leading him to a new employer, but evidence of how Varys has been working behind the scenes without anyone noticing to undermine the Lannister regime and further his own interests. Let's start by underlining the fact that Sir Barristan Selmy is the most famous and respected knight in Westeros by a long way, a living legend beloved by the commoners. In fact, so respected was he that he was allowed to join and head Robert Baratheon's Kingsguard after being on the losing side in the Battle of the Trident. He fought against Robert Baratheon, but got rewarded with not just keeping his job, but getting a promotion. And no one doubted for a second that he would serve honourably. But behind the scenes, Barristan himself never felt quite right as a member of Robert's Kingsguard. He did his duty, but it never quite sat right with him to abandon House Targaryen, whom he had given his initial pledge of loyalty and service to. And indeed, before Robert pardoned him, he had considered seeking out young Prince Viserys and offering his service, but decided against it in light of the prince's youth, and after learning that he showed signs of his father's Targaryen madness. He also considered it a mark of dishonour to serve alongside the newly nicknamed Kingslayer, Jaime Lannister. Barristan took his vows seriously, and was being asked to serve alongside the person who had murdered the man he had sworn to defend to the death. Not very honourable. But eventually, Sir Barristan decided that it would be wrong to turn his back on the new king, who had shown such grace in not only sparing him, but promoting him to Lord Commander, and served dutifully for the next decade and a half. Which doesn't mean that Barristan's discontent ever went away. We saw it bubble over when he was forcibly retired later, and Varys will have been well aware of this. Remember, Varys was the other most high-profile member of the Mad King's court to keep their job when the new king came in. Varys is perhaps the most astute judge of character in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. He often can predict eerily accurately how others will react. Knowing that gives him a lot of leeway to manipulate, particularly as Barristan himself is quite predictable. If you expect him to do the honourable, brave thing, you'll usually be right. It certainly was in this case. Just as Barristan spoke up about Jaime's ongoing role in the Kingsguard and later sided with Ned against his king's decision to send an assassin after Dany, Varys knew that Barristan would not sit silently when Robert's will was disregarded by the Lannisters. Nor what came next. Only a few days later was his dismissal from the Kingsguard. Joffrey and Cersei wanted a loyal, younger Lord Commander, so they fired the discontented older man, named Jaime in his place, and added Sandor Clegane to fill the missing spot. Barristan's initial reaction was shock and confusion. Varys, as he often does, played the role of mediator, telling Barristan that Lord Tywin Lannister has granted him a tract of land with servants to see to his every need. Though the words are gentle, this actually makes Barristan angrier. It's adding insult to injury, and we can be pretty sure Varys knew that that would be the case. Again, Barristan is predictable, and when he spat on their offer and called it pity, it was no surprise at all. At least, no surprise to Varys. Cersei and Joffrey are noticeably less competent at reading people. But there's a big difference between saying that Varys probably knew that Barristan would reject their generous offer and instead storm out in disgust, and saying that Varys had somehow manipulated the whole thing, that he knew exactly how to push Barristan's buttons, and he got Joffrey and Cersei to do it for him. So what evidence do we have that this was Varys? Well, in A Clash of Kings, we get this exchange between Tyrion and Cersei, while Tyrion is trying to understand exactly what had been going on in King's Landing. Tyrion speaks first. Was it Joffrey's wish to dismiss Sir Barristan Selmy from his Kingsguard too? Cersei sighed. Joff wanted someone to blame for Robert's death. Varys suggested Sir Barristan. Why not? So, Varys suggested that Barristan be dismissed from the Kingsguard. And as we've already noted, it was Varys who told Barristan that Tywin had set aside some land for him, angering him further. It's easy not to spot, but it is this suggestion from Varys that actually makes Barristan rage quit. He immediately responds by taking off his white cloak and throwing his armour to the floor. He is a knight, not a has-been to be pensioned off and given a house by the seaside. He is deeply, deeply insulted by Varys' offer, or Tywin Lannister's offer, as Varys calls it, except that Tywin seems to know nothing about it. The offer did not come from him. In fact, when Tywin hears that Sir Barristan has been dismissed, he is angry too. It is one of the things that prompts him to send Tyrion to take over as acting hand. So if Varys' offer didn't come from Tywin, did it come from Varys? Later, Tyrion points out something else to Cersei. Sir Barristan was the Lord Commander of Robert Baratheon's Kingsguard. The small folk talk of him in the same way they talk of Serwyn of the Mirror Shield and Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight. What do you imagine they'll think when they see Barristan the Bold riding beside Robb Stark or Stannis Baratheon? Cersei glanced away. I had not considered that. Father did, said Tyrion. It's easy to believe that Cersei hadn't thought through how Sir Barristan might react and what he might do afterwards, but not Varys. He will have been well aware and chose to say nothing. It's also hard to believe that Varys, whose little birds see and hear so much of what goes on in King's Landing, wouldn't have been able to keep track of Barristan afterwards and at least try to capture him, because Barristan didn't exactly rush out of there as fast as he could. No, he goes back to the White Sword Tower first, takes the time to write a record of his dismissal in the White Book, heads down to the stables, kills 2 guards who try to stop him, rides out of the city, sells his horse, grows a beard, then comes back into the city, witnesses Ned Stark's execution, goes to the Great Sept to pray for Ned's soul, and then heads back out of the city, having decided to try to find Viserys. Are we to believe that Varys knew nothing of that? Which brings us to the reason why Varys might have been doing this. He is trying to weaken the Baratheon Lannister hold on the Seven Kingdoms so he can place his own candidate on the Iron Throne. Barristan is not the only competent person that Varys has managed to remove from King's Landing's defences. There's also Kevan Lannister, who he killed in the epilogue to A Dance with Dragons, and Tyrion, who he smuggled out of the Black Cells. Of course, Tyrion, like Barristan, ends up in Pentos with Magister Illyrio, Varys' co-conspirator. So, might Varys have further had a hand in guiding Barristan to Illyrio? Perhaps, but we don't have any evidence for it. What we can say is that whereas Tyrion pondered whether Barristan would end up supporting Stannis or Robb, Varys, having known Sir Barristan from his first time serving the Targaryens, will have known better. Barristan would try to belatedly keep his initial vows, find Viserys, and serve him. And Viserys' last known permanent address before heading off into the Dothraki Sea was Illyrio's manse in Pentos. It's the only logical place for him to go, straight into the hands of Varys' ally, and Varys knew that. Once with Illyrio, they could have tried to get Barristan to join up straight away with Team Fagon, young Griff, the man claiming to be Aegon VI that they are trying to get on the throne, but plans change. They already have a famous Westerosi knight protecting him, Jon Connington, and meanwhile Dany has turned from an expendable princess to potentially a major part of their plans. Rumours have started to emerge that she is now based in Karth, has hatched dragons, and is actively looking for ships to take her and her entourage west. A long way from being expendable, she is now central to the plan. Perhaps they can even marry her to Fagon and have dragons on their team. But who to send to her to bring her back to Pentos? Well, I'm sure you're ahead of me here. Who better than a Westerosi figure so legendary that even Dany, who has never set foot on Westeros, will know about? A man whose deeds deserve her respect. A man able to make that connection to her family that she has lost. And a man who can win her trust even more by unmasking the traitor in her inner circle. Ser Jorah, who had been sending messages back to Robert Baratheon's spymaster. Because Varys and Illyrio now had plans for Dany, they wanted someone they and she could trust to protect her loyally, and could escort her back to Pentos, and they hoped at the time a marriage with young Griff, aka Aegon VI, with Daenerys and her dragons and armies joining his side for a forthcoming invasion of Westeros. Someone worth protecting, in other words. Barristan the Bold undoubtedly gives honour to any cause he's associated with, so there is no doubt that whichever Kingsguard or Queensguard he is a member of will gain a degree of authenticity simply by his membership of it, and by association that king or queen would themselves appear more legitimate. Ultimately, Varys wanted Barristan in Fagon's Kingsguard, because this is where his manipulating seems to have found its limit for the time being. Because Dany did not simply accept the offer to be shipped back to Pentos. Instead, she stopped off at Slaver's Bay, got herself an army of Unsullied, defeated Astapor and Yunkai, freed the slaves, and made herself ruler of Meereen. Along the way, she named Barristan Lord Commander of her Queensguard. Then she decided not to head west straight away, and not entirely of her own volition, headed off with Drogon into the Dothraki Sea. Fagon, young Griff, understandably got a bit tired of waiting for this woman he'd never even met, and launched his invasion anyway. So, looking at it from one perspective, all of Varys' manipulating behind the scenes has so far come to little. Barristan may no longer be there to help manage King's Landing's defences, which is a win for Varys, but he is still a long way from being a part of Team Fagon. But there may be one more twist to this storyline. Because at some point, Barristan will learn about young Griff, by then perhaps even fully established in King's Landing as Aegon VI Targaryen. Barristan's honour is a curious thing, because it makes him one of the more predictable characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. What would he do if Dany returns and does things he considers reminiscent of her father, Aerys? Is that possible? Well, George R. R. Martin rarely comments on blogs and the like about his writing, but he did once, about a Myronese Blot blog post, saying it got it completely. That blog post concluded that the whole plotline in Meereen is designed to manoeuvre Dany into a mental place where she'll decide to sideline her concerns for innocent life and take what she wants with fire and blood. Interpret that how you will, but I think it's fair to say that Dany's story in The Winds of Winter will be a darker one. And if at the same time we get darker Dany, Sir Barristan learns that there is another Targaryen alive, claiming to be ahead of Dany in the line of succession, and son of the Targaryen he rated most highly, Rhaegar, might he switch allegiances again? He might well think it's the only honourable thing to do. Perhaps Varys will get his way after all. What does Varys want? What drives him? He's one of the most mysterious characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, so let's take a look. In Ned's last chapter in A Game of Thrones, Varys visits him in the Black Cells. Ned asks him the question that so many have wondered. Tell me, Lord Varys, who do you truly serve? Varys smiled thinly. Why, the realm, my good lord. However could you doubt that? I swear it by my lost manhood. I serve the realm, and the realm needs peace. Which sounds very noble, but Ned isn't alone in being unsure of Varys' true motivations. He professes complete loyalty in turn to 3 kings of the 7 kingdoms, despite not coming from Westeros, and is clearly plotting to place young Griff, Fagon, onto the throne. He has climbed to the highest council offices and wears rich silks and velvets, and yet his private room is frugal and he sleeps on a stone bed. He claims to be acting for the children, and yet cuts the tongues out of his army of child spies. It's all very contradictory. So, what do we know about his background? He was apparently born a slave in Lys, the implication being that he is the bastard-born child of one of the many sex workers there, from an unknown father and a probably now untraceable mother. This is, of course, entirely believable, but also conveniently vague. He claims then to have been apprenticed as a child to a mummers troupe in a travelling show, when in Myr a sorcerer offered Varys's owner a hefty sum to buy him. The man drugged him, inducing paralysis, but he felt everything. The sorcerer made him into a eunuch and burned the parts he removed in a brazier. The flames turned blue, and a demonic voice spoke in a language he didn't understand. Varys tells Tyrion it's not the pain he recalls most of all, but that voice. This is terrifying, but did it really happen? There are big questions. Why would Varys's master sell him if he was a useful and promising member of the troupe? And why would the sorcerer pay such a large sum of money for Varys in particular when there will surely have been plenty of other cheaper orphan boys to choose from? Might he be descended from royalty, perhaps? That would explain the high price. We know there is supposed to be power in a king's blood and that of a king's descendants. Aerion Targaryen certainly spent several years in Lys, and George R. R. Martin has confirmed that he had bastard children there. Could Varys be a grandchild, say? Or how about the Blackfires? They were in Essos for a long time. A lot of people have theorised along those lines, and the fact we never find out Varys's hair colour only adds to the suspicion. And yet we don't have any proof, hence even more mystery. Anyway, after that horrific day, Varys found himself tossed out into the gutter and committed himself to staying alive and working his way up in the world. He made money any way he could, became a proficient thief, and when he had moved to Pentos, struck up a partnership with a young Illyrio Mapatis. Illyrio was a bravo, a sword fighter, and the pair of them came to an arrangement. Varys would steal things from rich townspeople, and Illyrio would hire himself out to track down the thief and return the stolen goods. In time, the stolen goods more often became nuggets of information and secrets, which were often worth more in the right hands. Which brought him to the attention of Aerys, the Mad King, who wanted a spy master he knew was not secretly loyal to Tywin Lannister or anyone else in the Seven Kingdoms. Who better than a bastard-born Essosi crime lord? So that's the story we have. Varys moved to King's Landing, took up the mantle of Master of Whisperers, and retained the confidence of the Iron Throne despite a couple of changes of king. Varys is a mummer, a criminal, and now a spy master. 3 different careers with overlapping skill sets that each involve deception. So how much of this backstory can we therefore believe? Well, many of the most convincing lies often have some element of truth to them, and I'm inclined to think that a lot of what Varys told us is true. Certainly there's no reason to doubt that he was running a crime syndicate in Pentos, based on learning important people's secrets and growing rich from it. That's why the Mad King hired him in the first place. His strong ongoing partnership with Illyrio is similarly self-evident, and him spending some time in a mummers troupe in his younger days also rings true. We see more than once quite how adept he is at disguises and changing his manner of speech. No, my instinct is that the biggest clues as to who Varys really is and what he wants lie in the things he hasn't told us. Why, for example, did he give up such a lucrative career in Pentos to work for such a dangerous and unstable employer as the Mad King? It wasn't for the money, or admiration for Aerys, or even just power for its own sake. He moved seamlessly from serving Aerys to serving the man who rebelled against Aerys, when he could easily have escaped back to Pentos. He never seeks to rise any further to the hand of the king, say, or live a conspicuously indulgent life. He seems to want to just be in that position as Master of Whisperers. So, what does he want? Well, we twice catch him speaking about his plans when he has absolutely no reason to lie. The first is when Arya overhears him speaking with Illyrio underneath the Red Keep. Arya doesn't understand what she has heard, but we do. Varys explains to Illyrio the political situation at the time in Westeros, and Illyrio says that events are moving too quickly. They plan to have Khal Drogo's Khalasar invade Westeros, but that can't happen until Dany's child is born. They discuss timings for a bit. They clearly want the Seven Kingdoms to be ripe for invasion at the right time. The second time we catch Varys speaking in a more unguarded way is in the epilogue to A Dance with Dragons. He shoots Kevan Lannister with a crossbow, then monologues at him for a bit, saying this: "This pains me, my lord. You do not deserve to die alone on such a cold, dark night. There are many like you, good men in service to bad causes. But you were threatening to undo all the Queen's good work, to reconcile Highgarden and Casterly Rock, bind the faith to your little king, unite the Seven Kingdoms under Tommen's rule." So he killed him. He goes on, "Your niece will think the Tyrells had you murdered, mayhaps with the connivance of the imp. The Tyrells will suspect her. Someone somewhere will find a way to blame the Dornishmen. Doubt, division, and mistrust will eat the very ground beneath your boy king, whilst Aegon raises his banner above Storm's End, and the lords of the realm gather around him." And that, I think, answers the question of what Varys wants. The young man claiming to be Aegon VI, to sit on the Iron Throne and rule. Very broadly, Varys' part of that plan has been to ensure that the Seven Kingdoms is vulnerable to invasion. But why does he want that? Perhaps this is, as he claims, just some noble ideal of putting a good ruler on the throne. He tells the dying Kevan that it was for the realm, for the children, and waxes lyrical about Fagon's good qualities, not just his education, but also his care for the small folk. But if so, why do it for the Seven Kingdoms? Why not Pentos or some other city in Essos that Illyrio and Varys both already know well, have influence in, and presumably care about? Why go over to Westeros at all? Which brings us back to those theories that perhaps Varys has something else in his history that he isn't telling us. In A Dance with Dragons, Illyrio tells Tyrion about his deceased lover and love, Serra, who he discovered at a brothel in Lys, just like Varys, who also came from Lys. Might there be a connection there? Could Varys and Serra perhaps be related? His sister, maybe? That would explain the close connection with Illyrio. And if young Fagon is Illyrio and Serra's son, and perhaps a secret Blackfire through the female line, that would explain why they chose the Seven Kingdoms. But all that is a lot of ifs. But for now, we can say with some certainty that the connection between Varys and Illyrio is more than just business associates. They have been close for decades and trust each other completely. It seems that asking what motivates Varys is also about what motivates Illyrio. Which is not to say that they don't each have different tastes and priorities. They are just two different sides of the same agenda. So what about those inconsistencies? If Varys cares about the children, why cut out their tongues? Let's go back to that conversation he has with Illyrio, who, it seems, supplies those children, little birds, for Varys. "I must have gold, and another 50 birds, says Varys. "So many?" The voices were fainter as the light dwindled ahead of Arya. "The ones you need are hard to find, so young to know their letters. Perhaps older, not die so easy? No, the younger are safer. Treat them gently. If they keep their tongues, the risk." The voices fade at this point, but it's clear that though Varys does demand that his child spies do indeed get mutilated like this, he wants them to be treated gently. How does that add up? And how can he rationalise brutally murdering Kevan and Pycelle while talking about doing it for the realm, for the children, and trying to justify his choice as king by saying that Fagon knows that kingship is his duty, that a king must put his people first and live and rule for them? He didn't need to say those things. Kevan would be dead within minutes. We have to assume that he meant it. So what's going on? I think in his own way Varys does care about the small folk and wants the best for them. There is probably some kind of familial link, but he genuinely also thinks that Fagon ruling as king would improve the lives of so many people. But crucially, in his mind, That means that all the violence and the murders are worth it. In the long run, he thinks the end justifies the means. George R. R. Martin has created Varys as a deliberately mysterious character. He wants us to be guessing at his motivations, but I think it is slowly becoming clear that Varys wants the best for the people of Westeros, and as a part of that wants to put Fagon on the Iron Throne. But in order to do that, he has to do the very things and become the very kind of person that have been so terrible for Westeros for so long. He thinks that to bring peace and justice, he must first bring war and horrors. Whose voice did Varys hear in the flames? What did it say, and what does it mean for the rest of A Song of Ice and Fire? What Varys heard from the flames as a child is one of the most intriguing mysteries in A Song of Ice and Fire. It was clearly a dramatic and traumatic experience, but it gets very little explanation, and the action moves on swiftly. Let's start by reminding ourselves of what Varys actually tells us. He is talking to Tyrion here about how Renly and Courtney Penrose might have died at Storm's End. That was Melisandre's shadow babies, remember, though neither Varys nor Tyrion know that, and wants to suggest to the sceptical Tyrion that it was magic. Tyrion expresses a healthy scepticism, and Varys responds by telling Tyrion the tale of how he became a eunuch when he was a young child working as part of a mummers' troupe in Essos. He says, "One day at Mere, a certain man came to our folly. After the performance, he made an offer for me that my master found too tempting to refuse. I was in terror. He gave me a potion that made me powerless to move or speak, yet did nothing to dull my senses. With a long hooked blade, he sliced me root and stem, chanting all the while. I watched him burn my manly parts on a brazier. The flames turned blue, and I heard a voice answer his call, though I did not understand the words they spoke. I still dream of that night, my lord, not of the sorcerer, nor his blade, nor even the way my manhood shriveled as it burned. I dream of the voice from the flames. Was it a god, a demon, some conjurer's trick? I could not tell you, and I know all the tricks. All I can say for a certainty is that he called it, and it answered. And since that day I have hated magic, and all those who practice it. If Lord Stannis is one such, I mean to see him dead." We'll come on to what was said and by whom in a moment, but we should acknowledge first that this is not just a friend sharing his tragic backstory. Varys was trying actively to win Tyrion to his side at this point, to prove his loyalty with a personal motivation not to let Stannis win. So perhaps this is a made-up story to win over Tyrion, or perhaps, as Varys himself admits, it was a long time ago. He was young and had been drugged, so perhaps he imagined it all. Both are possibilities. But let's go with the assumption that Varys is here telling the truth. So, what was going on? Well, probably the most intriguing part about the first half of Varys' story is why he was chosen. It seems the magician specifically asked for Varys and paid a very high price for him, which is strange because so far as Varys has told us, he was just an orphan boy apprenticed to some travelling mummers. There must have been hundreds, if not thousands, of similar boys throughout Mere, many of which would not have been missed if they were taken, but the magician wanted Varys and was willing to pay good money for him. Presumably there was something about Varys that made cutting him particularly efficacious or powerful. George R. R. Martin hasn't told us all the ins and outs of how magic works in his world, but magic clearly comes at a cost, and the greater the sacrifice, the greater the power of the magic. King's blood, for example, is said to be very powerful. Might Varys be special in this sense? Might he be secretly related to royalty? At the time, magic was hard to perform, particularly fire magic. The pyromancers in King's Landing were finding it hard to do their spells, glass candles weren't working, and fire mages in Essos had a lot less power than they did, say, after Dany's dragons were born, because that was the turning point for the kind of ambient level of magic in the world. So a magician wanting to perform some serious magic, like this seems to be, would need to get all of the help they could get, and we might expect unscrupulous sorcerers to be actively on the lookout for these kind of almost royals, bastards and distant relations. So it's definitely possible that Varys, perhaps even unbeknownst to himself, has some secret link to a kingly line. Though for our purposes now, it doesn't actually make much difference. Varys was clearly only important in making the magic ritual work. Once it was over, he was tossed out and left for dead. That won't tell us who was being contacted. The magician chanted a bit, called out, and threw Varys' parts onto the brazier, where the flame turned blue. Then a voice answered from the flames. Varys did not understand what was said, so presumably it was in a foreign language of some kind, and as he was the only witness to the ritual that we've met, we also don't and can't know exactly what was said. But even from that short scene, we can draw some pretty strong conclusions. First, the sorcerer was clearly trying to contact someone, and given the lengths that he went to, this must have been someone or something that he wouldn't just be able to go and visit. So either some spiritual being on another plane, or someone in a far-flung and inaccessible place. In other words, almost certainly someone we haven't met so far in the story, which is backed up by the fact that although this was apparently a memorable voice, Varys doesn't seem to have heard it since, so it's no one that he has ever actually met. Second, this seems to be someone acting on their own. The sorcerer found Varys himself, drugged and cut him himself, and performed the magic himself, even disposing of Varys afterwards himself. This isn't someone operating as part of a large organisation, nor does he seem to be a priest. Varys consistently calls him a sorcerer rather than a priest. And then third, and perhaps most intriguingly, the flames turned blue. So this is fire magic of a sort, and there's an obvious echo later in the story of Melisandre throwing the leeches with Edric Storm's blood onto a brazier in order to perform some magic. The flames then didn't turn blue, but there are a surprising number of times in the story where we do get blue flames, or blue fire imagery. In no particular order, and this isn't an exhaustive list by the way, there are more examples. In Jaime's vision, when he sleeps with his head resting on a weirwood stump, he and Brienne both carry swords with blue fire. We read, "As he raised the sword, a finger of pale flame flickered at the point and crept up along the edge, stopping a hand's breadth from the hilt. The fire took on the colour of the steel itself, so it burned with a silvery blue light, and the gloom pulled back." Patchface, in one of his nonsense but probably prophetic rhymes, says that under the sea smoke rises in bubbles and flames turn green and blue and black. Tessarion, the dragon ridden by Prince Daeron Targaryen in the Dance of the Dragons, has cobalt blue flame. The eyes of the others we see in the prologue are a blue that burned like ice. Then we're told the reanimated Waymar Royce's eyes burned blue, and Othor, the wight who attacks Jeor Mormont, is said to have burning blue eyes. When Dany enters the funeral pyre and the 3 dragon eggs hatch, we read that she saw crimson fire lions and great yellow serpents and unicorns made of pale blue flame. She saw fish and foxes and monsters, wolves and bright birds and flowering trees, each more beautiful than the last. She saw a horse, a great grey stallion limbed with smoke, its flowing mane a nimbus of blue flame. And then, if you want to go even wider, dragon glass is often referred to as frozen fire. There are plenty of ice dragon references, particularly in connection with Jon, and then we get onto the whole fire and ice together thing. That's a lot. So what do blue flames signify? Well, there's no one thing that covers all of those instances, but a lot of them definitely share a kind of death and rebirth motif. Dragons being born amidst a funeral pyre, Waymar Royce being killed then brought back as a wight. We're expecting Jon, or Jon's body, to be killed and then for him to come back from the dead. Patchface was thought drowned and then miraculously came back to life, and so on. And of course, fire and ice, or blue flames, are figuratively a representation of the meta-story itself, ice and fire at odds and also together. So what does all this mean? Well, feel free to speculate down in the comments section. I am ready for tinfoil on this. Could Varys have randomly overheard a conversation with the Great Other? Was this some pact with an unknown god? Simply some kind of long-distance communication? The truth is, though, that we don't know for sure. We simply don't have enough evidence to say definitively who or what that voice came from, or even, if we are even more honest, that this whole story wasn't just made up by Varys. Tyrion does notice that before he starts, Varys's voice changes subtly, perhaps as if this is a prepared speech or character that the old actor has used before. What I want to suggest to you is that we don't know, but that is okay. Maybe we'll learn more later in the story, but if we don't, this seems deliberate on George R. R. Martin's part. We aren't supposed to know. Varys doesn't know, and he was there. Tyrion certainly hasn't got an idea. As fans of A Song of Ice and Fire, we instinctively want to connect these kinds of loose threads to the larger story, but in a fully realised and complex world, not everything will connect together. There's a very real possibility that what was going on here was nothing to do with the main plot of A Song of Ice and Fire. This is a huge created universe with fully rounded cities and people. It would actually make it a lot smaller and less realistic a creation if all events and people and characters' pasts were tied in with this one main story. And when I say it was deliberate on George R. R. Martin's part, what I mean is that what he is wanting to show us is that the important thing here is the impact on Varys. As far as his character and story is concerned, what he heard is less important than how he reacted to it and how it affected him, how he let it shape his life. He was left to die and decided to live, to rise in power, driven by his hatred and fear of what had happened to him. It made him suspicious of magic, determined to succeed in life, and ultimately determined the person he became. This is a common theme in A Song of Ice and Fire. The actual words of prophecies, say, are less important than whether people believe them and act on them. It matters less whether Daenerys actually is the rightful heir of the Seven Kingdoms. What matters more is that she believes she is, and that belief drives the action. It matters less whether Stannis is or was Azor Ahai reborn than whether Melisandre believes it. Her belief and reaction to it is what drives the action. And it's the same here. What was actually said in that ritual and by whom is less important than the impact on Varys. His reaction to it is the foundation of who he is. How does Varys know so much? Who are his little birds? Are they still working for him? And what might that mean for Varys's fate in the story? We are introduced to Varys early in Book 1 and told straight away that he is a man who knows things he should not. It's Catelyn's 4th chapter, the one where she arrives at King's Landing, and she takes care to conceal herself, even bribing people, but fails spectacularly. She barely has time to get into an inn when Littlefinger finds her. How did he know? Varys told him, apparently. Lord Varys knows all, Peter said with a sly smile. He will be joining us shortly, but I wanted to see you alone first. It has been too long, Cat. How many years? Catelyn ignored his familiarity. There were more important questions. So, it was the King's spider who found me? Littlefinger winced. You don't want to call him that. He's very sensitive. Comes of being a eunuch, I imagine. Nothing happens in this city without Varys knowing. Ofttimes he knows about it before it happens. He has informants everywhere. His little birds, he calls them. One of his little birds heard about your visit. Thankfully, Varys came to me first. This is a big introduction. Varys knows all, we're told. Nothing happens in the city without him knowing. He has informants everywhere. His little birds, he calls them. Varys arrives soon after in the same chapter, and basically confirms all that. His little birds have furthermore told him about the Valyrian steel dagger she has, and its role in the attempt on Bran's life, the movements of Sir Roderick Castle since he'd been in the city, and what he'd talked about. It's an impressive flex from Varys. Though not seen, his little birds are introduced alongside him, which is fitting given how important they are to his success. But who are these little birds? Where did they come from? What role do they have in the story to come? Littlefinger gives us something of an answer when he tells Catelyn that Varys' little birds are a network of informers. Though we should be sceptical of anything Littlefinger says, he's absolutely truthful in this case, but this isn't saying much. Of course, Varys pays people in various places for valuable information and news and such. That much is plain. There have been many spymaster figures in A Song of Ice and Fire, master of whisperers or otherwise. A network of informers is something all of those characters have in common, and would likely hold true outside of A Song of Ice and Fire, even in the real world. No doubt Varys' network of people willing to sell him information is large, but Varys' ability to know everything that is going on in King's Landing goes far beyond that. It's easy to miss because it comes so early in the story, but it's notable that even Littlefinger is impressed by Varys' abilities. In other words, while all spymasters have information networks, Littlefinger himself included, Varys is exceptional. Within the confines of Westeros, we occasionally see someone with skills that go beyond the ubiquitous spy network, and often this is manifested via the supernatural. Bloodraven was a master of whisperers who could glean information by disguising himself with glamours and by listening through the ears of ravens, if not other animals. This idea is teased in A Game of Thrones too. Varys is a man whose level of knowledge borders on the supernatural. Characters like Catelyn and Ned wrestle with the idea that he is indeed using sorcery. Yet this is directly refuted by Varys himself when he tells Tyrion the story of his maiming. He claims he has hated magic and those who use it ever since the day he was cut. Of course, it's possible he's lying about that. We mustn't forget who we're dealing with. Nevertheless, the clues George R. R. Martin gives us regarding Varys' little birds contain very little to suggest the supernatural, nor does much else about Varys suggest magic. There's no direct evidence and some counter-evidence. Instead, the clues take us somewhere every bit as dark and terrible as the mysterious voice that Varys heard from the blue flame, and every bit as brutal as the ritual that cut him to summon it. That nameless sorcerer didn't kill Varys, he simply dumped him on the street expecting him to die. Varys famously told Tyrion that to spite the man, he resolved to live. He rose through the criminal ranks from the lowest of the low to the highest of the high, from the gutters to the prince of thieves in Myr. That ended when a rival informed on him, and he had to flee for Pentos, where he met Illyrio, where he started playing politics, and where he first started using little birds. At first, they were called little mice. They stole valuables and brought them back to Varys, but eventually they started stealing secrets, the sort that could harm or destroy elite individuals, if not families. The change to stealing valuable secrets instead of valuable goods is likely the difference between birds and mice in this context. Birds can speak and sing. In this case, they can speak and sing secrets. Mice cannot. With access to the secrets of half the nobles in Pentos, Varys no longer had to worry about the authorities coming to kill him, exile him, or send him back into slavery. Most of them owed him favours or relied on him for information, which sounds very similar to how he operates in Westeros. Over time, Varys perfected and improved his techniques, and this is why he was hired by King Aerys. Fast forward to the pages of A Song of Ice and Fire, where Varys has spent decades in the game, all along doing to other children a version of what was done to him. Like him, his little birds are highly trained, they use disguise, and they are slaves who have been maimed. It's a dark inversion of Varys' little birds singing to him, aka repeating stolen information they were taught to memorize. This is a brutal irony. His little birds cannot sing, nor even whisper, because they have no tongues. Their language is a unique written cipher known only to Varys. They cannot communicate with anyone but him, and perhaps each other. To these little birds, to these children, Varys is the voice in the blue flames, calling, answering, demanding more. 50 more little birds, he says to Illyrio in Arya's hearing deep below the Red Keep. She has no idea what they are talking about, no idea that 50 little birds means 50 children enslaved and brutally trained, 50 children with their tongues removed and never given a chance at normal life. Illyrio balks at having to provide 50 more. He complains about how hard they are to train, how much they cost, how easily they die. He suggests they use older children instead, but Varys says the risk is too great, and Arya hears no more of the conversation after that. If older children are not effective for his purposes, then what happens to the little birds who survive and grow older? One possibility comes to us through Tyrion's POV. He spends some time at Illyrio's manse and tries to start conversations with several different servants. None of them respond, none of them even talk to him. He brushes this off as them not speaking the same language as him, or he muses perhaps they've been commanded not to speak to him. But it could be that they are incapable of speaking. They could be retired little birds whose tongues were removed long ago. A Song of Ice and Fire shows us in many ways that violence begets violence. Varys is a microcosm of that concept. That which was done to him for power, he has done to others. But can he keep this a secret forever? Will he get away with it? He might, but it's probably more likely that he's eventually discovered. This isn't a one-off that he could sweep under the carpet. There are now hundreds, if not thousands, of victims, many of whom will presumably now have grown up, and many of whom might not be as loyal as Varys thinks. One of these children could be strong enough to break through the conditioning, or be caught by one of Varys's many enemies. Varys guards against this by ensuring his little birds can't speak or write, so even if they got caught, they could reveal nothing. But is that as strong a defence as he thinks? George R. R. Martin has already given us one example of a child who can't speak, but when caught gives up valuable information to his previous master's enemies. Wex, Theon's squire, who informs Lord Manderley and Robert Glover of the location of Rickon and Osha, despite being born dumb. As Robert Glover says, "Until he learns more letters, we will never know half the truth, but he came to us knowing yes and no, and those can go a long way once you find the right questions." And the more little birds there are, and the more overt their actions, the more likely discovery becomes. Previously, they seem to have been mostly just listening in on conversations and the like, but as Varys and Illyrio's long-term plan to place young Griff on the throne is coming to a head, he appears more willing to use his little birds aggressively. For example, the final chapter of A Dance with Dragons is Kevan's epilogue, a chilling scene where Varys shoots him with a crossbow before a group of little birds with daggers finishes him off. The way they are described is unsettling. We read that they were all around him, 6 of them, white-faced children with dark eyes, boys and girls together, and in their hands the daggers. It's the final line in A Dance with Dragons, quite a way to finish a book, and this was a surprise to many readers. We knew they spied and stole information, but this was perhaps our first evidence that the little birds were also used to kill. What other uses might Varys have for them? It's uncomfortable to imagine. A small child, clearly one of the little birds, opens the door to Pycelle's apartments for Kevan, and he seems to find it completely unremarkable, throwing his cloak at her without thinking. There are clearly children all over the Red Keep, running messages, cleaning things, opening doors, and apparently many of them are little birds. The denizens of the Red Keep are blithely living their day-to-day lives, not knowing that, or ignoring, the small army of potential assassins that scurry around beneath their notice. So who might discover the truth of this, and how will they react? That second part is quite important, because in the cutthroat world of Ice and Fire, some people will surely not care, or just view it as how kingdoms are run. But others who might care might find out. For example, Qyburn is Varys' successor as Master of Whisperers. He will be developing his own informant network in King's Landing. We read in Cersei's POV that she thinks that Varys' spies have simply moved over to Qyburn, but Qyburn is surely not that naive. There's a good chance he will be keeping an eye out for whatever remains of Varys' network. And if he does discover something and tell Cersei, well, I think we know how she will react, swiftly and with brutality. Or how about Arya? I have previously speculated on the heavy foreshadowing George R. R. Martin seems to be giving us for Arya skin-changing into one of the cats in the Red Keep, perhaps Balerion himself. And 2 or 3 of the names on her list are in King's Landing, so there's a healthy chance she will at least consider going there when she leaves Braavos. and cats are even more unnoticed than small children in the Red Keep. She has already witnessed Varys ordering in some more little birds from Illyrio. If she then discovers what that meant, it will surely offend her strong moral compass and lead to Varys's name being added to her list. Someone else who will surely hate the idea of what Varys has done to all those children is Dany. And if things go the way we think they might, Varys may well be back out of hiding by the time she arrives in Westeros, if young Griff takes King's Landing. While she may not personally know immediately, if Tyrion is by her side, he's definitely the kind of person who can figure things out. He has first-hand experience of being Hand of the King with Varys as Master of Whisperers, and spent time at Illyrio's manse, where the servants are suspiciously mute, retired little birds, perhaps, and we know he suspects Illyrio to be a slaver, so it seems that there are several ways for this secret to come out, and surely a few others that you could think of. And who would save him? As he said himself a few times, he has no armies, no house, or even valiant brothers to defend him. He makes it sound so noble, almost brave, that he has so few advantages compared to the highborn of Westeros. Tyrion even feels bad for him. Varys claims he buys his life anew each day by providing information to those who could easily have him killed, information they view as too valuable to live without. But they don't know that that valuable information comes to them over the dead bodies of slave children. Varys was highly successful before his little birds, but they are what took him from an expert to one of the world's greatest in the Game of Thrones. They are both his greatest power and his greatest liability. If the secret of his little birds is exposed, it would likely be his end. He would no longer be able to buy his life anew. It would be too costly. It would mean, ultimately, that which has given Varys his greatest advantage throughout his career may also earn him his downfall. If this dark secret is discovered, it's likely something that even the silver-tongued Varys wouldn't be able to talk his way out of, and perhaps that is right, even from his own perspective. If he truly is trying to build a better, fairer Westeros, then there surely wouldn't be a place in it for someone who does the dark things that he has done. Is Varys really a eunuch, or is he maybe a woman in disguise? It's one of the questions I'm asked the most, so let's take a look. Why do some fans of A Song of Ice and Fire believe that Varys might secretly be a woman? And do I agree? I am asked this question a lot in the comments here and on my live streams on my other channel, IDG Live. Let's start with why some people suspect that there's more to Varys than meets the eye, so to speak. That although he, and I will call him he throughout this video just to avoid confusion, that although he is clearly a mysterious figure, he's hiding something even more fundamental. That he isn't a eunuch, he's a woman. Could he be? Technically, yes, inasmuch as we don't get to see what is under his robes or have any other 100% proof one way or the other, and he may well be a good enough actor to pull it off, but I think the evidence in support isn't very strong. Varys, of course, does give off feminine vibes, wearing robes for preference, speaking in a high-pitched voice, giggling. He wears perfumes, his hands are described as soft, and so on. One of the disguises he adopts is that of a woman, too, as Tyrion discovers. A woman sidled into the light, plump, soft, matronly, with the round pink moon of a face and heavy dark curls. Tyrion recoiled. "Is something amiss?" she asked. Varys, he realised, with annoyance. And Varys at least once refers to himself as like an old woman, while several people disdainfully comment in various ways that he isn't a man. That's a lot of woman vibes going on, which you could interpret, and some have interpreted, as evidence that he is secretly a woman, but equally it could be evidence that he isn't. Would he really lean into the feminine energy if he was trying to convince everyone that he wasn't a woman? Personally, I doubt it. In truth, Varys gives off eunuch vibes to the characters in the story. None of the characters who meet him question this rather basic fact about him, including the usually very astute characters like Tyrion. So let's go a bit deeper and ask why he might disguise himself in the first place. If you are a woman, why would you disguise yourself as a eunuch so completely for so long? I suppose the argument here is twofold. First, no one suspects a eunuch. They can't have children, so can't establish a legacy or noble house. They are often patronised and assumed not to be capable of more demanding tasks, so they can get away with quite a lot simply because no one suspects them. Varys certainly makes use of this. But is that really that different to how women are treated in that rather misogynistic world? So perhaps it's not that he doesn't want people to know that he's a woman in general, but a specific woman. The whole eunuch thing is just an even stronger disguise. Many have noted that he keeps his hair shaved. Is that to hide the fact that it is a distinctive colour, perhaps Valyrian silver? Well, perhaps we're now getting somewhere. He was born in Lys, and the predominant colouring there is silver-gold hair. There's a lot of Valyrian blood there, and probably some Targaryen or Blackfire blood too. Certainly you can find a lot of linguistic hints in the text that link Varys to Targaryens. Only Targaryens know all the secrets of the Red Keep's tunnels, and Varys. His head is the shape of an egg, like Egg from Dunk and Egg, that kind of thing. And several fans have gone even further and speculated that he might be Illyrio's wife, or young Griff's mother, or perhaps aunt, something that might help explain his apparent commitment to getting young Griff onto the throne, assuming he is a Blackfire. But how could we possibly know? This, I'm afraid, is where I believe all the theorising starts to fall down. How could we tell? Well, in the absence of a POV chapter or a confession, probably the best indicator is how he is when he thinks he can let his guard down a bit, when he's with someone about to die or with someone who actually knows who he truly is. Thankfully, we do have a couple of examples of this, so let's take a look. And let's start with that scene in Book 1, where Arya sees Varys and Illyrio meeting in secret beneath the Red Keep. Varys is with his partner in plotting, clearly unguarded as he is spilling a lot of secrets that would show he is a traitor. He doesn't think anyone is listening in. And in this context, Arya, who has no hidden agenda here at all, in fact she doesn't even know what's going on, thinks Varys is a man, based on how he looks, his voice and so on. She thinks that 3 times. But perhaps even more damningly, Illyrio also treats Varys like a man in his language usage. He jokes that Varys is a sorcerer, not a sorceress. Remember, there is no need for those two to pretend Varys is anything other than he is at that moment in time. And he calls him his old friend. Not what you would call your beloved wife, or even probably your sister-in-law. So all the context clues here are that when Varys is off guard and with an old friend who knows the truth, he comes across as a man, not a woman. The other example we have is with Kevan. When speaking to Kevan, having shot him with a crossbow in the epilogue to A Dance with Dragons, Varys appears his usual self, slippers, powdered hands and so on, but his voice seemed lower, as if the higher-pitched voice was the disguise he usually used but didn't need to in that moment. He was actually more masculine than his public profile. So the context clues for when Varys is alone actually don't suggest that he is secretly a woman. But let's take a look at the timelines. Do they work for Varys secretly being young Griff's mother or someone like that? Well, the first thing you have to acknowledge with the timelines is how long this con would have had to go on for. Varys moved to King's Landing sometime in the year 278, or perhaps the next year. We are now at the year 300 AC, so that's 22 years of being Varys the Eunuch. And he was headhunted for the role before that, so he must have been known as Varys the Eunuch in Pentos for some time before that as well. We don't know Varys' exact age, but that must surely be the vast majority of his adult life, a quarter of a century or more of being in a full-time disguise. That's a long, long con. And for what? What actual gain is there appearing as a eunuch rather than a woman for that long? We've had at least 2 Mistress of Whisperers before, so it's not as if anyone thought that role couldn't be filled by a woman. But probably even more damning to this theory is the fact that the disguise would have had to start before young Griff was born. Well before. Tyrion estimates that young Griff is 15 or 16 years old, so 6 years after Varys arrived in King's Landing. If you hold that young Griff is actually Aegon, son of Rhaegar, as claimed, then he would be perhaps 18. That's still 3 or 4 years after Varys arrived. So if we are to hold that Varys is secretly a woman, we have to hold that he has held up that act for a quarter of a century, without pause, and even in secret with someone who knows his true identity. Indeed, when his guard is down, he seems to go even further the other way, appearing more masculine. And if we further are to hold that the reason why he has kept up this act for almost his entire adult life is to get and keep his position as Master of Whisperers in King's Landing without suspicion in order to aid young Griff's path to power, we have to hold that the decision to adopt that persona was taken several years before young Griff was even conceived. And almost certainly several years before he was headhunted, or knew he might be headhunted for the role of Master of Whisperers. Why adopt that disguise before even having a reason to adopt that disguise? Simply put, I don't think the timeline supports this theory, and I don't think the real-world advantage of being perceived as a eunuch rather than a woman, or even a different man — Varys is definitely capable of adopting that disguise — is enough to justify the time and energy needed to keep up the pretense for so long. Which isn't to say I don't think there's any merit to these ideas. Varys is a mystery, and we shouldn't take his account of his youth at face value. We don't have any other witnesses to what he says, and he is a professional liar. There must be a reason why he is so set on supporting young Griff. It's not just for the good of the realm, I'm sure. But it's almost certainly also not because he is young Griff's mother or aunt or someone like that. Young Griff, Fagon, Aegon VI, he goes by many names, but whoever he is a very important character in the books of A Song of Ice and Fire, launching an invasion of Westeros, no less. But who is he really? Arguably, the most significant character in A Song of Ice and Fire missing from the TV show was a young man called young Griff. He is significant because he claims to be Aegon Targaryen, the eldest son of Rhaegar Targaryen, and therefore the rightful Targaryen heir to the Seven Kingdoms. He has amassed an invasion force before Daenerys, has powerful allies, has landed in Westeros, and is actually probably just a few weeks away from being able to launch an attack on King's Landing. So, is he who he claims to be? Let's start with what we know about him for sure. We first encounter him when Tyrion meets him in A Dance with Dragons. Tyrion has escaped King's Landing and is hiding out at Illyrio Mopatis's manse in Pentos. It's fair to say that his mind is mostly occupied by the next jug of wine and ruminating over his father's dying words, but his interest is piqued by the chance to join a group of travellers heading down the River Rhoyne to Volantis, with a view to eventually meeting Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. But he soon realises that his travel companions are just as intriguing. In particular, he concludes that Griff, the leader of the group, is an identity taken on by Jon Connington, a former Hand of the King and close companion of Rhaegar Targaryen after his rumoured death from alcoholism. When you add in the other odd characters on the boat, Haldon Halfmaester, Septa Lemore and so on, it's quite the mystery for Tyrion to solve, and working it all out seems to invigorate him a bit. But back to young Griff. This is how we first see him. Tyrion craned his head to one side and saw a boy standing on the roof of a low wooden building, waving a wide-brimmed straw hat. He was a lithe and well-made youth, with a lanky build and a shock of dark blue hair. The dwarf put his age at 15, 16, or near enough to make no matter. The wide-brimmed straw hat immediately takes fans back to Egg from the Dunk and Egg stories, who similarly wore a hat like that, so perhaps George R.R. Martin is immediately trying to make us think of a young Targaryen travelling the land in disguise, an image we'll come back to. It takes Tyrion only until they are passing through the Sorrows to see that this is, ostensibly at least, Aegon, son of Rhaegar Targaryen. Although, of course, everyone knew that Aegon had been brutally murdered at the end of Robert's rebellion by the Mountain. We read this. The lad flushed. That was not me. I told you, that was some tanner's son from Pisswater Bend whose mother died birthing him. His father sold him to Lord Varys for a jug of Arbor gold. He had other sons, but he had never tasted Arbor gold. Varys gave the Pisswater boy to my lady mother and carried me away. So that's the story we have. Young Griff is Rhaegar's eldest son, Aegon, secretly and dramatically saved by Varys from the sack of King's Landing years earlier at the end of Robert's rebellion. Since then, it seems, he has been raised undercover in Essos by Jon Connington and with the support of Illyrio Mopatis, the ridiculously rich magister who protected Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen for a while, and Varys, who has retained his place as spymaster in King's Landing, but not given up on the dream of there being a better king out there than either Aerys or Robert Baratheon. We are told that Varys arranged for him to be raised not in riches and privilege, but in learning what a ruler really needs to learn, in Varys's mind at least. This is what he says when he's about to kill Kevan Lannister, so with no obvious reason to lie. Aegon has been shaped for rule since before he could walk. He has been trained in arms, as befits a knight to be, but that was not the end of his education. He reads and writes, he speaks several tongues, he has studied history and law and poetry. A sceptre has instructed him in the mysteries of the faith since he was old enough to understand them. He has lived with fisherfolk, worked with his hands, swum in rivers and mended nets, and learned to wash his own clothes at need. He can fish and cook and bind up a wound. He knows what it is to be hungry, to be hunted, to be afraid. Tommen has been taught that kingship is his right. Aegon knows that kingship is his duty, that a king must put his people first and live and rule for them. Which sounds fantastic, and to be fair, although we haven't seen huge amounts of him yet, he does seem to be quite well adjusted, certainly better king material than many others, and we have that dunk and egg imagery again. Aegon V, who had his apprenticeship out on the highways and byways of the Seven Kingdoms rather than at court. As king, he then spent a lot of his time, radically, trying to improve the rights and protections of the small folk of the land, at the expense of the lordly classes, a cause seemingly close to Varys' heart. So it has to be said, young Griff, as we'll call him from now on just to ease any confusion, seems to have been raised to be a good king, not an entitled one. A king who would care about the poorest and most vulnerable under his care. Whatever the political machinations going on around him, young Griff would probably be a good king, or try to be. Whether he is who he claims to be or not, and whether he succeeds or not, I don't think George R. R. Martin wants us to forget this. He just doesn't think that being good is necessarily enough in a grey, power-hungry world. Okay, so that said, let's put morality and idealised kingship to one side for a moment and try to work out whether young Griff really is who he is supposed to be, Aegon VI. Well, he himself certainly seems to think so. There is no hint in the text that he believes he has 2 layers of secret identity going on. And Griff, John Connington, similarly also seems to believe it. We have chapters from his POV and he thinks a couple of times about putting Rhaegar's son upon the Iron Throne. And although his hair is dyed blue for most of the time we see him, his eyes definitely are purple. On the other side of the Narrow Sea, on hearing that someone had landed in the Stormlands with an army claiming to be Aegon VI, Kevan Lannister, who had witnessed the presentation of baby Aegon's body to the new King Robert years earlier, recalls that the girl had been recognisably the Princess Rhaenys, but the boy, a faceless horror of bone and brain and gore with a few hanks of fine hair. None of us looked long. Tywin said that it was Prince Aegon, and we took him at his word. So there is a definite lack of concrete evidence that this isn't Aegon VI. In fact, the only person who could probably provide that is Varys, who allegedly did the baby swap, and as we've already noted, he told a soon-to-be-dead man that this definitely was Aegon VI. Varys also undoubtedly was one of the few people who could have pulled off such a switch without anyone knowing. He has the skills, contacts, and access to secret passages in the Red Keep that others simply don't. All of which is quite convincing. So why do so many people in the fandom believe that all is not as it seems? Firstly, the baby swap plan only really works well in retrospect. Varys may have been able to swap out baby Aegon before the attack, knowing he would likely be killed by the Lannisters, but how was he to know that Aegon's body would be unrecognisable afterwards, and his sister Rhaenys's would still be clearly identifiable? Was it just a lucky guess? Surely a more straightforward answer is that Varys instead later used the fact that Aegon's body was unrecognisable to come up with a believable backstory for the person he wanted on the throne. But the big problem here is one of motivations. Varys has no particular loyalty to the Targaryens that we know of, still less to Rhaegar, whose apparent coup attempt against Aerys II at the tourney at Harrenhal, Varys scuppered. So why go to so much trouble to save Rhaegar's son? Illyrio is the one who bankrolled all this, but similarly, why is he so willing to throw his weight and money behind the plot? Tyrion asks him this to his face, and when Illyrio claims he has been promised a castle and the position of Master of Coin, Tyrion simply doesn't believe him. Liar, thought Tyrion. There is something in this venture worth more to you than coin or castles. Illyrio goes on to say that it is also about a debt of affection to Varys, which sounds closer to the truth but brings us back to Varys' motivations. In fact, Varys seems less concerned about the surname of the ruler than their character, which is laudable, even if we don't always agree with his methods. Varys serves the realm, or so he tells Ned Stark, not any particular family. So he's not a Targaryen exceptionalist in any way. He didn't even come from Westeros, and having come from the gutters himself, cares for the small folk a lot more than the rich and privileged. He saw firsthand how Aerys and then Robert, then Joffrey, all ruled poorly in their own ways. It's not a giant leap of logic to suggest that the idea of creating a perfect ruler will have appealed to him, and he won't have cared who the child was. What would have mattered to him is that the people believe that young Griff was Aegon Targaryen and welcomed his claim to the throne, not whether he actually was who he claimed to be, or even who he thought he was. He didn't need Aegon Targaryen, grandson of the Mad King and son of the man so consumed with prophecy that his pursuit of it threw the kingdom into a savage civil war. He just needed someone who looked like they might be Aegon Targaryen. The question is, where might he find someone who looks like a Targaryen? On the evidence we have from Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon, all over the place. For example, Targaryen bastards and their descendants in King's Landing and Dragonstone, and those of Valyrian descent in Volantis, Lys, and elsewhere in the Free Cities. And there is, of course, an offshoot of the Targaryen family in Essos that everyone thinks has died out, the Blackfyres. There's a whole history here to House Blackfyre that I'll save for another video, but the short version is that they descend from Daemon Blackfyre, a bastard son of King Aegon IV, who thought he had a rightful claim to the Iron Throne. But despite several rebellions and invasion attempts over the years, he and his descendants and supporters were exiled to Essos. We're told that the last of the Blackfyre pretenders was killed in the War of the Ninepenny Kings some 40 or so years ago. Might Varys have picked one of them and just pretended from an early age that this was Aegon Targaryen? It's definitely possible. So all of that works well with Varys' motivations, and there's no doubt that he is capable of such underhand and subtle tactics, but where is the evidence to support this? Most people start with an intriguing conversation between Tyrion and Illyrio in A Dance with Dragons. Tyrion wants to know why the Golden Company, more on them in a moment, would support putting a Targaryen on the throne, young Griff, when their entire history was to support Blackfyres against Targaryens. Illyrio brushed away the objection as if it were a fly. Black or red, a dragon is still a dragon. When Meleys the Monstrous died upon the Stepstones, it was the end of the male line of House Blackfyre. The cheesemonger smiled through his forked beard. The clear implication is that the female line of Blackfyres is still going strong. In other words, that the last or one of the last Blackfyre pretenders might not have had any sons, but they did have a daughter, who in turn may have had sons. Why would that matter if it weren't important for the Golden Company's support for young Griff? If this were generations ago, then perhaps the genetics would have been so diluted as to not matter, but 40 years, which is when the last Blackfyre pretender was killed, it isn't that long ago. It's in living memory. In fact, the person who killed that last Blackfyre pretender was Barristan Selmy, who is still very much alive in the books. So there is, or was, probably a woman with Valyrian heritage and looks, and an ancestral claim to the Iron Throne through House Blackfyre, alive at around the time to make her a contemporary of Varys and Illyrio in the Free Cities. And if she had a son, they would indeed be about young Griff's age. Again, this makes it all possible, but it isn't really evidence. Let's hold that thought for a moment, though, because although it's interesting from an historical perspective, we know George R.R. Martin always lays the groundwork for these kinds of revelations. If young Griff really is a Blackfyre in disguise, there will be hints throughout the books. And there are. George R.R. Martin spends a lot of time talking about the Blackfyres, way more than he needs to if they were just a random offshoot of the Targaryens who tried and failed to win the throne. We're told of 5 different invasion attempts, not just as dry historical facts, but how they impacted on characters in the story that we know. The rivalry between Daemon Blackfyre, the first pretender, and Bloodraven. We see the second attempted rebellion, in which a Blackfyre pretender comes to Westeros in disguise, first-hand in the Dunk and Egg story The Mystery Knight. The third rebellion again saw Bloodraven directly involved. The fourth had Dunk leading the charge. The fifth, the War of the Ninepenny Kings, was the one we've already mentioned with Barristan Selmy. Not only that, but Blackfyre history leaves some pretty important threads just lying around. The Golden Company, for example, are name-checked dozens of times in the books, and we're told repeatedly about how they aren't just a sellsword company. They are the descendants of Blackfire supporters exiled in Essos and waiting to return. And the sword Blackfire is missing, the great ancestral sword of Targaryen kings that was given to Daemon Blackfire, last seen in the possession of Aegor Rivers, Daemon Blackfire's biggest supporter and the founder of the Golden Company. I'll do a whole other video very soon about where that sword is now, so keep an eye out for that. But these are not just small clues. George R. R. Martin is telling us repeatedly how important the Blackfires are to this story. So the Blackfires are going to be important in the rest of the story. There's probably at least one Blackfire descendant out there somewhere. We have a young man with Valyrian features now claiming to be a Targaryen heir, and the Golden Company, that bunch of Blackfire loyalists, are mysteriously supporting him, which is already painting quite a clear picture. What we don't have yet is why Varys and Illyrio might be behind such a plot. Well, you will find plenty of theories out there connecting Varys to the Blackfires. Perhaps he is secretly one himself, hence him keeping his head shaved like an egg, or perhaps he is secretly not a eunuch but a woman, and so on. But as fun as they all are, none have huge amounts of supporting evidence. For me, the link is instead probably through Illyrio. Illyrio is a fascinating character. Like Varys, who he became friends with at a young age, he worked his way up from the streets until he reached a position of power in Pentos. He was once married, seemingly for political gain, to the Prince of Pentos's cousin, but then fell deeply in love with a woman called Serra. Serra was everything to him. The scandal of him and Serra led to the Palace of Pentos being closed to Illyrio, but he didn't mind because he had found love. But then Serra died of the Grey Plague. This hit Illyrio hard. He still carries around a picture of her in a locket and, so he says, keeps her stone hands in his bedroom. He swears solemn oaths in her name. From the picture in the locket, we learn that Serra had bright blue eyes and silver blonde hair, classic Valyrian looks, just like young Griff has. And although we see Serra written in the text spelt as Serra, S-E-R-R-A, that's from Tyrion's perspective, what he thinks and hears. But Illyrio has a thick accent. Could it actually be Sarah or Sera, a very Targaryen name? It wouldn't be the first time that George R. R. Martin has made use of the POV mechanism to hide clues in the text. Could this woman with Valyrian features and a Valyrian-sounding name be of Valyrian descent? Maybe even Blackfire descent, which would explain how he, and apparently only he, knows that the Blackfire line had continued through the female line. The hints then follow that she and Illyrio had a child. George R. R. Martin makes a point of showing us that Illyrio had rather curiously kept a chest full of clothes for a young boy, but Serra tragically died. Let's follow the logic. A plot was hatched between Varys and Illyrio to get Illyrio's son onto the Iron Throne, to honour the beloved Serra's family line, and perhaps even her explicit dying wishes. It would be a powerful contrast to Lyanna's dying wishes for Jon. Varys, by this point, had moved over to King's Landing and was acting as spymaster for Aerys II, then Robert Baratheon, neither of whom were exactly model rulers. Young Griff would be tutored and trained to be the perfect king. Varys would then have a ruler who cared for the realm, and Illyrio would have his and Serra's son on the throne. Illyrio himself admitted that his motivation in all this was not money or power, but a debt of affection. Everyone would get what they wanted. In order to get the support they needed, they couldn't just admit that young Griff was a Blackfire, though. The Blackfires had tried 5 times to claim the throne. It had never worked. So instead, he would claim to be Aegon VI, the true Targaryen heir, and when the time was right, Varys would eventually start spreading the rumour that he had saved the babe from Gregor Clegane, and so on. A Blackfire with a black dragon sigil would be pretending to be a Targaryen with their red dragon sigil. As Illyrio says pointedly to Tyrion, black or red, a dragon is still a dragon. And this is where the Golden Company comes in. The Golden Company, remember, are effectively the Blackfire's standing army, established by Aegor Rivers and used to spearhead most of the Blackfire rebellions. Of course, they would support a secret Blackfire invasion. But just as importantly, they have a reputation for never breaking a contract. A perfect reputation, until they break one to come and support this cause. When Tyrion asks why on earth they would ruin their reputation, Illyrio simply says that some contracts are written in ink and some in blood. In other words, they are honouring their ancestral blood vow to support the Blackfires. There is no other reason for them to do it. And there are more hints elsewhere that Aegon may be a false dragon. One of the visions Daenerys has in the House of the Undying is of a cloth dragon swaying on poles, cheered by a crowd, which seems to be one of the lies she must slay. And Quaithe also warns her to beware the Mummer's dragon. The imagery both times seems to be clear. This is a pretend dragon, not a real Targaryen, and it is Dany's role somehow to expose it. It all adds up, explaining everything from Illyrio and Varys' motivations, the Golden Company's actions, and even some of Dany's visions, to why George R. R. Martin tells us so much about the Blackfires in the main story. There is no smoking gun here, no 100% conclusive bit of evidence that this is true, but we shouldn't expect one yet, because George R. R. Martin is obviously wanting to do a big reveal later in the story. And as for Varys having no reason to tell the dying Kevan Lannister a lie, I actually don't think there's a contradiction here. Young Griff has started his invasion by this point, so Varys actually wants the rumour that baby Aegon was saved from death all those years ago to start spreading. And if Kevan is mortally wounded, there are others there, his little birds, the children who work for him, and Varys is too clever to trust anyone 100%, even them. And he certainly doesn't owe Kevan Lannister honesty when he's about to kill him. Him asserting that young Griff really is Aegon is exactly what we would expect. Finally, let's look at what this all means for the plot. Young Griff saying he is Aegon VI immediately sets up a good old-fashioned Targaryen succession crisis. He certainly thinks that he is ahead of Daenerys in the line of succession, and would think the same about Jon if he ever learned of him. But it's hard to imagine Daenerys standing meekly aside for him, and your guess is as good as mine as to how she would react to a marriage proposal. Of course, Daenerys sweeping in to claim her crown unopposed just isn't how Targaryen succession has ever worked. Fire and Blood shows time and again how there is a Targaryen succession crisis in almost every generation. This generation won't be any different. And in this context, it perhaps ultimately doesn't matter for the plot whether young Griff really is Aegon VI, or is a Blackfire, or just some random silver-haired youth picked out by Varys and Illyrio. He believes he is, and people around him believe he is, and his list of allies is growing swiftly. As Varys comments elsewhere, power resides where men believe it resides, no more and no less. What is Varys and Illyrio's master plan? It seems to change a lot, but what is the plan? This is the latest in a loose sort of series looking at Varys, Illyrio, young Griff, and all of that. You don't need to have watched any of the others before you watch this video, but I will build on what I've said in them a few times, so if you want to, there's a link to the playlist down in the description. If you are a bit confused by Varys and Illyrio's master plan in A Song of Ice and Fire, then do not worry, you are not alone. And if it feels like it changes quite a lot, then that's because it does change quite a lot. What we'll do in this video is try to break down those changes and why, so we know what the plan is now. But as an overview, here is Tristan Rivers, a senior member of the Golden Company, sharing his thoughts about the changeability of Illyrio's plans. Which plan? The Fat Man's plan? The one that changes every time the moon turns? First, Viserys Targaryen was to join us with 50,000 Dothraki screamers at his back. Then the Beggar King was dead, and it was to be the sister, a pliable young child queen who was on her way to Pentos with 3 new-hatched dragons. Instead, the girl turns up on Slaver's Bay and leaves a string of burning cities in her wake, and the Fat Man decides we should meet her by Volantis. Now that plan is in ruins as well. I have had enough of Illyrio's plans. Robert Baratheon won the Iron Throne without the benefit of dragons. We can do the same. His frustration is palpable, but he does actually give a pretty accurate summary of how the plan evolves over time. So let's start at the beginning, because despite all the changes, the objective seems to stay the same, to get young Griff, also known as Aegon VI or Fagon, onto the Iron Throne via an invasion from Essos headed up by the Golden Company. This is the case regardless of whether you believe that young Griff is actually a Blackfire, Rhaegar's son Aegon, or a complete nobody trained up by Illyrio. Personally, I like to think that this is Illyrio's promise to his dying wife that he loved so much, that he would make their son, a Blackfire through the female line, king of the Seven Kingdoms. Give or take a couple of years, this son was born at the same time as Aegon, had the classic Valyrian looks, and Varys could come up with a convincing explanation for how he was rescued from the sack of King's Landing. Very broadly, the plan, which probably emerged over a few years, was for Illyrio to take control of raising young Griff and getting an invading army ready to go when he was old enough, and on the other side of the narrow sea, Varys' job was to prepare the Seven Kingdoms for invasion, so it was vulnerable at the right time. This clearly would require some coordination, and that is exactly what we see happening the first time we see the two of them together, through Arya's eyes deep beneath the Red Keep. Varys tells Illyrio that war is brewing, and Illyrio responds, "Too soon, too soon. What good is war now? We are not ready. Delay. We must have time. The princess is with child. The Carl will not bestir himself until his son is born. You know how they are, these savages." "What would you have me do?" asked the torchbearer, a stout man in a leather half-cape. It seemed to Arya there was something oddly familiar about him. "If one hand can die, why not a second?" replied the man with the accent and the forked yellow beard. "You have danced the dance before, my friend." "Before is not now, and this hand is not the other. Delay, you say. Make haste, I reply. Even the finest of jugglers cannot keep 100 balls in the air forever." "You are more than a juggler, old friend. You are a true sorcerer. All I ask is that you work your magic a while longer." So the plan originally seems to involve Viserys and the Dothraki invading Westeros at a time when the Seven Kingdoms are weak. The argument about timing here is because the Seven Kingdoms seems a matter of days or weeks from civil war, but Khal Drogo seems a very long way from being willing to sail to Westeros. In theory, according to Tristan Rivers, the Dothraki would have joined up with the Golden Company and invaded. Dorne would probably also have been involved. They hated the Lannisters, and maybe even Varys and Illyrio's extensive spy network had uncovered the marriage pact between Viserys and Arianne, formally tying the Martells into the plot, whether they knew it or not. At which point, you may wonder what Viserys has got to do with all of this. If they wanted to put young Griff on the throne, why bother with Viserys at all? Well, keeping young Griff a secret for as long as possible certainly seems to have been a deliberate strategy, because it eliminated the possibility of assassination attempts, a very real threat, and because they genuinely seem to have wanted him to be brought up outside of a life of privilege. As Varys says, "Aegon has been shaped for rule since before he could walk. He has lived with fisherfolk, worked with his hands, swum in rivers and mended nets and learned to wash his own clothes at need. He can fish and cook and bind up a wound. He knows what it is like to be hungry, to be hunted, to be afraid. Tommen has been taught that kingship is his right. Aegon knows that kingship is his duty, that a king must put his people first and live and rule for them." A laudable aim, and if Tyrion is right to judge him about 15 or 16 years old when he meets him, that would make him just 13 or 14 at the beginning of the story, perhaps still a bit too young to lead, even by Westerosi standards. Whatever the reasons, Illyrio and Varys clearly wanted Viserys to head up the invasion, even though Illyrio at least knew what he was like. After that, well, we don't know the details of this bit of the plan as it never actually happened, but at some point they would clearly have brought young Griff to the fore and announced him as Aegon VI, who, as the eldest son of the Mad King, could be argued to be ahead of the second son Viserys in the line of succession. Viserys would surely object, but who would you rally behind? In short, Viserys was necessary in the short term, but dispensable in the longer term. An attitude it seems likely they held towards Dany at the start as well. Her use to start with was to draw in Khal Drogo, but that's about it. When Drogo seems to have indefinitely suspended any plans to attack Westeros, that's when Varys informed King Robert that Dany was pregnant, leading to the assassination attempt on her, and Khal Drogo recommitting once more to the invasion. You'll notice that Varys worked on both sides of that, incidentally. He hires the assassin and tips off Ser Jorah to foil the attempt. It therefore seems likely that Varys was happy with either ending, Dany living or dying, as long as Drogo was angered into action. So at that point, things must have seemed to be back on track. The Golden Company was alerted to be ready, and the Seven Kingdoms was completely unaware, tearing itself apart as it was in a civil war. But then things went wrong. First, Viserys died, then Khal Drogo did, so that plan had to be put aside. Instead, something unexpected then happens. News emerges that Dany has hatched 3 dragons. Perhaps she wasn't so useless after all. They could forget the Dothraki. They now had dragons, provided they could get Dany on side, of course. Young Griff was now a year older, so he could head up the invasion, and they could probably just marry Dany off to him. You know how Targaryens are. Their man still gets on the Iron Throne. So Illyrio dispatches 2 of his finest, Strong Belwas and Sir Barristan, to sail to Qarth with 3 ships and fetch her back to Pentos. At which point, let's switch back over to King's Landing, because something else Varys has been doing there is trying to remove the competent leadership of the city, one by one. He plots to get Ned Stark sent to the Wall, though is blindsided by him being killed. Subtly pushes Joffrey to dismiss Sir Barristan, knowing he would likely next head to Illyrio or Dany. Works with Jaime to free Tyrion from the Black Cells and sends him to Illyrio, and also, if you look back at it, gives rather precise instructions to Tyrion as to how he might find his father's chambers through the secret tunnels. 230 rungs up, the tunnel to the left for 60 feet, the 3rd room on the left. He didn't make Tyrion kill his father, but he certainly gave him the opportunity. Then, of course, there is the death of Kevan Lannister, who he even apologises to, admitting that it was just because he was doing too good a job managing the city. Anyway, Daenerys ends up ignoring Illyrio's offer via Sir Barristan to go to Pentos, and instead sells the ships he provided to pay for the Unsullied, proceeding to head north along the coast of Slaver's Bay, destroying or setting free cities as she goes, depending on your perspective. Illyrio then confidently assumes that she must be about to continue that march westwards along the Demon Road towards Volantis, so instructs the Golden Company to wait for her there, not Pentos, and he dispatches young Griff to head down the Rhoyne to meet her there too, along with Tyrion, the latest new ally Varys has smuggled out of King's Landing. Though then Dany foils that plan by not heading west, but instead trying to govern Meereen wisely, and eventually disappears on Dragonback into the Dothraki Sea. So that plan also has to change. And by the time young Griff arrives to meet up with the Golden Company, they and he are well and truly frustrated by all these changes of plan. They're on to Plan 4 by this point, and they haven't even set sail for Westeros. So young Griff decides that they should just do it. Forget about the Dothraki and dragons and Daenerys. They should strike while the iron is hot, take a few strategic strongholds in the Stormlands before the Lannisters even know they are under attack, and gather support as they go along. They are pretty confident that Dorne will fall into line. Jon Connington has contacts in the Stormlands, and they even have some mysterious friends in the Reach they think they can rely on. And the Seven Kingdoms is on its knees after 18 months or so of remorseless war. Stannis has taken much of the Stormlands army north to the Wall, so that is vulnerable. The Lannisters are focused on bringing the Riverlands under their control, and Varys has ensured that the Lannisters and Tyrells are the weakest of allies in King's Landing. A strategy, it has to be said, that Tyrion urged young Griff to adopt when they were on board the Shy Maid, telling him not to wait for Daenerys in Volantis, but instead to go on the offensive. "Land and raise your banners, and men will flock to your cause, lords great and small folk too. But do not wait too long, my prince. The moment will not last. The tide that lifts you now will soon recede. Be certain you reach Westeros before my sister falls and someone more competent takes her place. All you need to do is raise your banners, rally your supporters, and hold until Daenerys arrives to join her strength to yours." So that seems to be the plan now, and so far it seems to be working. We haven't seen much of the invasion firsthand, but they certainly seem to have captured a lot of territory in the Stormlands and maybe even Storm's End, as hinted at in one of the pre-release chapters of The Winds of Winter. Incidentally, when Tyrion later hears that they are going with this plan, he appears surprised. It's quite a deep cut, but when giving the advice he was playing a game of Cyvasse against young Griff, which ended when young Griff went on the offensive but neglected to bring his dragon to the centre of the action, a big mistake which cost him the game. Foreshadowing? Probably. So that is how Varys and Illyrio's plan has evolved over the course of the story, and what is most noticeable is that the plan they finally ended up with is not what they wanted. It's what young Griff and the Golden Company agreed after growing frustrated with all the changes. Still, Varys and Illyrio are used to their plans going slightly awry, and we should expect them to roll with the punches. Certainly we see Varys respond to hearing that the invasion is going ahead anyway by eliminating Kevan and Pycelle and framing the Tyrells, which will almost certainly lead to Cersei doing something rash. Varys and Illyrio have been planning this for years, and theirs is a flexible and complex plan. After vanishing at the end of A Storm of Swords, Varys reappears in the epilogue of A Dance with Dragons to assassinate Sir Kevan Lannister. Why? What does Varys expect to gain from the murder? In the epilogue to A Dance with Dragons, Kevan Lannister is having dinner with Cersei and Tommen when a message arrives from the Grand Maester. Kevan excuses himself and is escorted into Pycelle's chamber by a silent child, who we can only assume is one of Varys' little birds. Moments after he enters the room, Varys shoots him with a crossbow. The similarity to his brother Tywin's murder comes to mind immediately for him, and he blurts out the name Tyrion. But instead, Varys emerges from the shadows clutching the murder weapon, and in true Varys style, he apologises, telling Kevan it's not personal. He says, "Sir Kevan, forgive me if you can. I bear you no ill will. This was not done from malice. It was for the realm, for the children. This pains me, my lord. You do not deserve to die alone on such a cold, dark night. There are many like you, good men in service to bad causes, but you are threatening to undo all the Queen's good work, to reconcile Highgarden and Casterly Rock, bind the faith to your little king, unite the Seven Kingdoms under Tommen's rule, so Varys kills him." Most of Kevan's epilogue chapter earlier is spent at council. A number of issues are discussed by Hand of the King Mace Tyrell, Master of Laws Randall Tarley, Grand Maester Pycelle, and Kevan Lannister himself serving as regent. The most prominent topic is the invasion of the Stormlands by a young man claiming to be Aegon, son of Rhaegar Targaryen, at the head of the famously dangerous Golden Company, alongside Jon Connington. Though they don't agree on much, the small council does agree that this threat requires an immediate military response, lest the danger grow. Aegon could win castles, allies, reputation, time to spread word of his arrival and his identity, best to stop him as soon as possible. Mace decrees that he will march south with his army as soon as his daughter Marjorie's trial is complete. Waiting for the trial to be over isn't exactly immediate, however, not to mention the possibility that Marjorie could lose. Would Mace still march his army south in that case? Probably not. Thus, the threat of violence hangs over the scene, and the capital, even without considering Aegon in the south. Some members of the small council are concerned that they themselves might be targets. For example, Pycelle expresses concern to Kevan that Mace Tyrell mislikes him, so he needs guards. Kevan is diplomatic, but inwardly scoffs at the notion that Mace would have Pycelle killed. While many on the council are more concerned with their own lives or families, Kevan is more concerned about other matters, namely the aforementioned invasion by Aegon. Of course, Kevan will find Pycelle dead only a few pages later. It turns out they both had a piece of the truth, but neither of them had the whole. Simply put, Pycelle was not terribly worried about the danger in the Stormlands, but very concerned about the danger in-house. Kevan was more concerned about the danger in the Stormlands, while not terribly worried about the danger in-house. It turns out that the danger in the Stormlands and the danger in-house are one and the same. Varys is back after nearly 2 full books missing, and he's with Aegon. He's also no longer the Varys of the past 20 years. He's no longer pretending to be squeamish or neutral, no longer trying to keep the realm at peace while his plans and his young king mature. The time is nigh. Instead of order, Varys wants chaos, so Aegon can save the realm to win the throne, as Stannis himself put it. Stannis was of course referring to himself saving the realm to win the throne at the time, but it's just as true for any other claimant. The realm wants peace and stability most of all, and will favour a king who brings them that. That is the core reason for the murder of Kevan, creating chaos to help Aegon win the throne. But let's get more specific. Varys tells Kevan, as he's dying, who will take the blame for his murder. We read, "Your niece will think the Tyrells had you murdered, mayhaps with the connivance of the imp. The Tyrells will suspect her. Someone somewhere will find a way to blame the Dornishman. Doubt, division, and mistrust will eat the very ground beneath your boy king, while Aegon raises his banner above Storm's End and the lords of the realm gather round him." This is the heart of the matter, driving a wedge between Lannister and Tyrell, the houses who are the biggest obstacles to Aegon's claim. For Varys' young king to win the throne, it's better if the Lannisters and Tyrells are not on good terms. Better still if they turn on one another and become enemies. Even better than that if the Tyrells are an enemy of the Lannisters and an ally of Aegon. Perhaps Margaery could marry Aegon instead of Tommen. It's not clear what exactly Varys has in mind for the Tyrells. It might be that he's offered a different house in the Reach, the seat of Highgarden, in exchange for their support. We can only be certain that Varys wants to break the Lannister-Tyrell alliance. Like Tywin before him, Kevan was doing a good job at uniting Lannister and Tyrell, at forging them into a unit that might hold the throne, so he had to die. And by killing him with a crossbow, Varys is attempting to accomplish the opposite, to pit the two allied great houses against each other. Kevan was also keeping Cersei in check, and was preparing to send her back to Casterly Rock. Kevan's death put Cersei back in charge as regent for Tommen. It's another important part of the plan. This effectively replaces someone competent with someone who will play right into Varys' hands. It is no secret that Cersei hates the Tyrells. Her lies are the entire reason Margaery is on trial in the first place, and we can be sure she will continue to find ways to manipulate those proceedings. Varys knows this, and knows that Margaery's fate is tied to Mace's army. As we and Mace himself established, as long as Margaery is in danger, the Tyrell army will not march south to face Aegon. Not to mention, Cersei being in charge in general is good for Aegon's chances. Many prospective allies might think twice about joining her. In fact, her leadership may give some noble houses good cause to choose Aegon, including many who would have unquestioningly followed Tywin. Mace Tyrell is not an example of exemplary leadership either, not to mention there's a very good chance some members of the Small Council, and other houses in general, are likely already in league with Varys and Aegon, but simply haven't made their move yet. Many noble houses will use that all-too-common strategy of waiting, delay and prevaricate and dissemble until one side appears to have the upper hand, and then join that side. Varys is nothing if not convincing, meaning many may join Aegon because Varys will seduce them with his silver tongue. Of course Aegon is winning, he'll say. He might even be telling the truth. We should mention Pycelle here as well. Kevan was technically the second murder that day. Varys killed Pycelle first and used him as bait, but it wasn't just bait or revenge for all the insults Pycelle heaped on Varys over the span of 2 decades on the Small Council. Though Varys might have enjoyed murdering Pycelle, given all that, it actually fits his plan perfectly when we scrutinise it. With Kevan, Varys used the crossbow so people would think of Tyrion. With Pycelle, there was no need to be particular with the murder weapon, so he simply smashed his head in from behind. We can be fairly sure it was him and not one of the little birds, since they are children and not likely to be capable of crushing his skull, plus they're likely too short. Varys spent 20 years pretending to be soft, effeminate, afraid of blood, barely capable of witnessing violence, let alone personally dispensing it. Now he is killing people with his own hands, but still keeping it a secret. For the moment, only us readers know. Now we see how this long-cultivated image fits into his overall plan. Many will overlook him as a culprit until it's too late. They will be too busy fighting each other, which is exactly what he wants. The death of Pycelle adds to the suspicion that Tyrion is responsible. It was Pycelle who accused Tyrion during his trial of stealing poisons from him. More importantly, the trial was seen by many and widely discussed afterwards. Tyrion and Pycelle's animosity towards one another was on display for all to see. The motive is plain for all to see. Even though Tyrion is innocent of Joffrey's death, though technically Tyrion did steal those poisons from Pycelle. Pycelle was right about that. Pycelle has long been an open Lannister toady as well. When sides are taken, he always takes Tywin's or Cersei's. Since Varys wants Aegon to take the throne, this removes an enemy from the Small Council. Pycelle would clearly support Tommen over Aegon. And there's also the matter of his replacement. When Tyrion stripped Pycelle of his office earlier in the story, the Citadel were apparently on the verge of sending a Maester Gorman to be the new Grand Maester. It's an open secret that Maester Gorman was born Gorman Tyrell. Mace Tyrell's uncle, no less. Another Tyrell on the small council. It's easy to see that Cersei might immediately conclude that the Tyrells were behind Pycelle's murder. So the murders of Kevin and Pycelle are intended to sow chaos and discord in the Red Keep that Aegon can exploit in his invasion. They were done in a way to divert attention away from Varys and onto Tyrion and the Tyrells, and maybe even the Martells. Cersei will very obviously react strongly. Removing the competent Kevin and replacing him with the less competent Cersei will, I'm sure, have explosive consequences. And maybe those murders are just the beginning. Now that Varys' 20-year plan is culminating, now that Aegon has landed to push his claim for the Iron Throne, Varys can operate more aggressively and openly. Will young Griff or Aegon VI's invasion succeed, and will he become king? And what then in the Winds of Winter? Young Griff, the boy claiming to be Aegon VI Targaryen, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and rightful heir to the Iron Throne, has launched an invasion of Westeros with the Golden Company, right at the end of A Dance with Dragons. It's early days, but it seems to be going well so far. So will he succeed? Will he become king? Well, let's start with what we already know. So far, his army is basically just the Golden Company, although that is good in and of itself. They are the finest and largest sellsword company in Essos, 10,000 men, including 500 knights, 1,000 bowmen, and 24 elephants. And they have allies that they are hoping will rally to the cause. We looked last time at their claims to have friends in the Reach, and concluded that these friends are probably a handful of powerful but not top-tier houses, like Peake, Tarly, Florent, and maybe even Rowan. They will also surely have a few similar friends in the Stormlands, though for various reasons they are unlikely to be able to field many soldiers. And most importantly, they expect House Martell to join them. We'll look at Doran Martell's full plan at some other point, but it's fair to say that the Martells hate the Lannisters for what they did to Elia and her children, and have long relied on strong marriage alliances with the Targaryens to bolster their position, as far back as Diran II, as well as, of course, Doran's sister Elia marrying Rhaegar. Since the fall of the Targaryens, Arianne Martell was secretly engaged to Viserys, Quentyn Martell was sent to Meereen with a view to marrying Dany, and now Arianne has been sent to the Stormlands to investigate the alleged Aegon VI. We know how impulsive, proud and keen for power Arianne is, and willing to seduce men for her own advantage, so what seems likely to happen when she meets the powerful, attractive and charming young Griff? And how will Doran react when he receives back from Meereen the bones of his beloved Quentyn, together with a note from Sir Barristan explaining that Dany's dragons killed Quentyn? Dany herself is now married to someone else, and has actually now disappeared as well. It's pretty clear which Targaryen Doran will want to back, and it won't be Dany. And as far as we can tell, this will seem like a sensible move, because the invasion is progressing well. It didn't start off particularly well. The Golden Company's fleet was scattered by a storm just past Lys. The Volantene ships they used put to land where they could, rather than all at the designated landing spot of Cape Wrath in the Stormlands. Still, when they do land, they make swift progress. The main force that does land at Cape Wrath is split into 4, with Jon Connington leading one of the quarters to retake his ancestral home of Griffin's Roost, and 2 others claiming Crow's Rest and Rain House, respectively. The other scattered members of the Golden Company seemingly attack and take wherever they have landed, Mistwood and parts of the Rainwood, and some islands, Estamont, Tarth and some of the Stepstones. It gives them a small toehold in Westeros, but a toehold nonetheless. And given that most of the soldiers of the Stormlands were either killed in the Battle of the Blackwater Bay or taken north by Stannis, and what is left is likely to be against the Lannisters, or maybe even know Jon Connington personally, the welcome they receive seems less than hostile, and at times amicable. Their misinformation strategy also seems to have bought them a little time. Jon Connington announced his return by letter to various places, though most people think he's dead, and the lack of Targaryen banners has disguised their true intention and loyalty. The result is that the small council may agree on the need to do something, but there is debate about who they are fighting and what they want, not single-minded focus on a threat to the throne itself. The next step, though, is to claim Storm's End, and they seem to have a strategy for that, too, Jon Connington asserting that he intends to take it by guile. And take it they do, at least judging from the pre-released chapters of The Winds of Winter, which are obviously not fully canon yet, but the closest we will get for now. Added to which, with Storm's End falling to them and various lords rallying to the cause, there is also a reasonable chance that Aegon might still gain more symbols of legitimacy. The sword Blackfire, for example, the sword of Targaryen kings. I did a whole other video on that if you're wondering how he might get that into his possession, but long story short, I suspect that Illyrio has it. And perhaps Aegon might start appointing more members to his Kingsguard. He already has Sir Rolly Duckfield, a personal pick, but we know that John Connington has in mind that the honour might best be held in reserve for warriors of greater renown, whose fealty would add lustre to their cause, and the younger sons of great lords whose support they would need in the coming struggle. There are plenty of names that fit this bill, including Sir Gerald Dane, Darkstar, with the sword Dawn, perhaps, who would put people in mind of Sir Arthur Dane wielding the same sword. Then there's Richard Lonmouth, Rhaegar's former squire, if, as I suspect, he still lives, and Sir Donald Swan, brother of the current Kingsguarder Balon Swan. There's already a bit of foreshadowing about him switching sides once more. All in all, a strong start, you might think, with the potential for even more to come. But the real prize is King's Landing itself, and that is ripe for the taking. Indeed, it's hard to imagine a set of circumstances in which King's Landing is more open to falling. The last chapter we have in A Dance with Dragons sees Kevan Lannister, who had been doing a solid job in managing the tensions in the city, murdered by Varys, who is Team Young Griff. In doing so, he deliberately frames, well, everyone, as he explains to Kevan, "Your niece will think the Tyrells had you murdered, mayhaps with the connivance of the imp. The Tyrells will suspect her. Someone somewhere will find a way to blame the Dornishman." This leaves Cersei in charge. Not the most stable pair of hands imaginable. And it also leaves Varys free to cause more mayhem. And don't forget that there are 2 Sand Snakes on the way, determined to kill Lannisters. And the other issues are stacking up. The Crown is deeply in debt to the Iron Bank, who seem to have thrown their weight behind Stannis now. There are local troubles with House Rosby, and the Faith of the Seven is flexing its muscles under the High Sparrow, including through the forthcoming trials for Marjorie and Cersei. Oh, and food is barely getting into King's Landing. The small folk are struggling. The historical parallels here abound. Cersei is often seen as being reminiscent of Mad King Aerys II, under whose rulership King's Landing fell, of course, but I wonder whether she might also have echoes of Rhaenyra in The Dance of the Dragons, with the people rioting against her as they starve and are taxed punitively. The idea of a noble young king-in-waiting at Storm's End also has parallels. That's where Jaehaerys I held out, while the Lords of the Realm fled from supporting Maegor the Cruel to him. Varys sums up a lot of what he hopes will happen in his little speech to the dying Kevan. "Doubt, division, and mistrust will eat the very ground beneath your boy king, whilst Aegon raises his banner above Storm's End and the Lords of the Realm gather round him." Probably most crucially of all, Cersei will be in charge at King's Landing, and she will want to deal with both the Tyrells, who she will think killed Kevan, and the Faith of the Seven, who imprisoned her. Perhaps her revenge won't be exactly like what happened on the show, with the blowing up of the Great Sept, destroying the Tyrells, the High Sparrow, the lot of them, or perhaps it will be. Either way, Cersei will get her revenge, and the Tyrells, or what is left of them, will quit King's Landing seeking another king to back. If I had to guess, the rumours of an army heading down to Storm's End that we hear in the pre-release chapters of The Winds of Winter are not of Mace Tyrell marching to resume his siege, but to pay fealty to Aegon. Let's not pretend that the Tyrells don't have a track record of this. They were supportive of King Aerys II, then swore fealty to Robert Baratheon the usurper, then switched to Renly Baratheon, then after he was gone allied themselves with the Lannisters and the new King Joffrey. That's 3 times they've switched their allegiance in short succession. A 4th time wouldn't be a shock, particularly if Cersei does something rash, and she almost certainly will do something rash. And so I think we can expect to see Fagon marching on King's Landing maybe halfway into the Winds of Winter. Could the Lannisters dig in and successfully defend King's Landing? Possibly, although with Varys sowing the seeds of discord inside the walls of the Red Keep, the people potentially turning against Cersei if she does anything remotely like blowing up the Great Sept, and actually surprisingly few Lannister soldiers actually there. Kevan Lannister mentions there being hundreds of Lannister soldiers in the castle, compared to the tens of thousands there would be in a united Golden Company, Stormlands, Reach and Dornish army. A victory for Aegon seems likely in these circumstances. Very likely, in fact. Cersei and her loyalists will be forced to flee, probably back towards Casterly Rock in the first instance, which, as an aside, fits with George R. R. Martin's confirmation that we will see Casterly Rock in a POV chapter. As he said, "You know, the story takes over. The story makes its own demands. There are other parts of Westeros that you will see in the last few books. I mean, you've never seen Casterly Rock, you've never seen Highgarden. I think both of those locations will play key roles in the books to come." By far the most obvious POV character to visit there is Cersei. And then what for King's Landing? Well, Aegon will want to build up the accoutrements of power and stabilise his rule. Even if he holds King's Landing, he won't have won the war. The Lannisters will fight on. Stannis will still claim the throne. The Iron Islanders under Euron won't bend the knee, and so on. And there will be inevitably questions about whether he actually is Aegon. So he will want to look as Targaryen-y as possible, to look like the rightful heir. And even if he has other priorities, his advisors will definitely want that. He will look Targaryen, claim Targaryen heritage, probably have the sword Blackfire, and a Kingsguard that echoes old Targaryen Kingsguards, and now he will sit on the Iron Throne, and I'm sure be crowned with one of the many Targaryen crowns, and very probably by the High Septon. He will look every inch the Targaryen king. And I suspect that the people will love him. If he has support from the Reach, he will be able to get food back into the city, and he will probably be able to deliver a period of relative calm for the region. The immediate threats to the city will have gone, with Cersei retreating to the Westerlands, Stannis in the north, the Starks and their allies also focused up there, and Euron basing himself off the coast of the Reach for the time being. Dany is still months, if not years, away from launching her invasion. And we have some prophecy that also suggests he will be popular. One of the blizzard of visions that Dany received in the House of the Undying was that of a cloth dragon swayed on poles amidst a cheering crowd. Dany interprets this as a mummer's dragon, so a false dragon, which fits with our central theory that young Griff is actually technically a Blackfire rather than a Targaryen. We'll come back to that point in a bit, but the idea of a cheering crowd suggests that he will be popular, which fits with what we know of him, taught to care about the small folk. So what is to stop him once he has the Iron Throne? Well, two things, possibly. The first is grayscale, or the Grey Plague. On the TV show, Jorah Mormont contracted grayscale in Essos and hid it from those around him before finally being healed by Sam. In the books, it is Jon Connington who has the affliction, and is keeping it secret. Grayscale is a mysterious, magical disease, and those who contract it are usually either killed or quarantined for their own safety and that of others. Its highly infectious cousin, the Grey Plague, can sweep through cities in weeks, killing thousands. We hear about it 3 times in the background to this story. In Old Town, then Pentos, then Yi Ti during a Feast for Crows. Are these just foreshadowing of an outbreak closer to home? Perhaps. An outbreak of the Grey Plague in King's Landing would kill thousands, perhaps even tens or hundreds of thousands. If the rumour gets out that it was caused by Aegon's invasion, that would certainly turn the people against him. The second thing in Aegon's way will, of course, be Daenerys. It's a subject for another video, but Dany's time in the Dothraki Sea will almost certainly change her. That's not me saying that, it's George R. R. Martin, but again, that's the topic of another video. She had been content to rule Meereen, but now, potentially with the Dothraki on her side, lots of new and old allies waiting for her in Meereen, Unsullied, the Second Sons, Mokoro, etc., and a lot of ships. Her own invasion will probably start soon. She will sail to the Seven Kingdoms to claim what she believes is hers by fire and blood. She will probably stop off a couple of times en route to deal with a few old grudges, the other cities of Slaver's Bay maybe, Volantis and so on, but her, the Dothraki, the Unsullied and her dragons will set off westwards and probably arrive around the end of the Winds of Winter. She will arrive to discover that there is already somebody in place in King's Landing who claims to be her nephew, but ahead of her in the Targaryen line of succession. I think she will be suspicious of this. One of the repeated exhortations from the House of the Undying was that she was the slayer of lies, and Quaithe will have made her wary of the mummer's dragon, that she needs to expose the lie. He is not a true Targaryen, and although I think we are still a long way away from knowing exactly how this will happen, I personally suspect that Dragonfire will play a role, as it may in ending many plagues. Like the Great Fire of London in 1666 ended the Great Plague of 1665. So, although I am sure there will be diplomatic overtures, young Griff was definitely hoping that Dany would arrive with her dragons and join his side, and maybe even marry him, Daenerys doesn't seem likely to entertain much opposition to her sole rule. Still, around this time, I suspect that the threat from the others will start to become very real, even to those in King's Landing, and maybe Jon will appear. And Doran Martell? With the downfall of Aegon, if that happens, Doran's last plan will fall apart. The Martells' previous plotting and engagements with the Targaryens lost him his uncle, his sister, a niece and a nephew. And then his follow-up ended with the death of his son Quentyn, his brother Oberyn, probably several nieces and maybe even his daughter Arianne. I can't imagine him surviving that, psychologically, if not in actual terms. Young Griff will claim the throne, I feel confident about that, but he probably won't hold it. And when he falls, so will many others. The tragedy of young Griff is that he probably would have been a good king, given time. He probably would have cared about the small folk and tried to rule justly, but this is not a story with a happy ending. The ending will be satisfying, but not necessarily the one we, or the people of King's Landing, want. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this compilation. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more like this. If you'd like to see more videos breaking down A Song of Ice and Fire in nerdy detail, there's a playlist on the left of your screen now. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of the screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.